The year 1863 began with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all slaves in rebelling states were henceforth free. But the declaration only applied to the states that had seceded from the Union. Maryland was therefore exempt. And that meant plantations run on slave labor could continue in locations like where I'm standing now. This is Oakley Cabin in Brookville. During the Civil War, it was part of Dr. William Magruder's plantation. Magruder reportedly owned 19 slaves to help farm the land. Today, the Oakley Cabin African American Museum and Park is run by the county's Department of Parks. Because this dwelling continued to be occupied by tenant farmers after the Civil War, a visit here reveals a broad range of the Black American folk experience. While it didn't end slavery in the entire country, the Emancipation Proclamation captured the hearts and minds of millions of Americans. Now, every advance of federal troops expanded the domain of freedom. Moreover, it made possible the acceptance of black men into the Union Army and Navy. The Bureau of Colored Troops was established in May of 1863. Recruitment in Maryland began 2 months later, but was soon suspended because slaveholders wanted compensation for their property. Loyal slaveholders were appeased with $300 per person, and the recruitment of Negroes began again. Resistance diminished. When black soldiers discovered their pay was less than their white counterparts, recruitment fell dramatically. In the end, more than 8,700 black men from Maryland enlisted in the 6 regiments of the U.S. Colored Troops. We look like men of war. In the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia began a second invasion of the North. They were headed towards a decisive battle on Union soil. The newly appointed General George Meade led the Army of the Potomac to meet Lee. For 3 days in early July, they fought a battle that became a turning point of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg. Before reaching that town just north of the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, massive numbers of troops once again passed through Montgomery County. On June 27, 1863, Jeb Stuart led 5,000 Confederate cavalrymen across the Potomac at Rouser's Ford. Their plan was to cut between the Union Army and the city of Washington. The rain-swollen river made crossing difficult, but by 3 a.m. the next morning, they had crossed without alerting federal troops. I'm standing now at Rouser's Ford, just a few yards away from Violet's Lock. Stuart seized the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal from here on up to the next lock. He wanted to disrupt this important federal supply line. Stuart's men captured at least a dozen boats with Union soldiers and grain. They then damaged the wooden gates at Lock 23 and Guard Lock 2 and drained that section of the canal by breaching the embankment. It took 3 days for the canal to be operational again. 1 day later, Jeb Stuart and his cavalry rode into Rockville to a boisterous reception. Southern sympathizers welcomed the raiders and cheered. One of Stuart's men had this to say.
There was a large female academy in Rockville, and flocks of pretty young maidens congregated in the front to greet us, showing strong sympathy for our cause, and cutting off all the buttons they could get hold of from our uniforms for souvenirs.
Other folks in town had quite a different take on this parade. Dora and John Higgins, who were staunch Unionists, operated a store out of their home, not far from where I'm standing now. When Stuart's men rode into town, Dora was just getting ready for church. Her husband had gone ahead. She later wrote these words to her mother.
I saw a whole column with the rebel flag charging furiously down past William Brewer's, and the next moment, a discharge of musketry, and there was a demand to know where the man who lives here was. I could, with truth, say that he was not in. Where is he? And tell I did not.
After they left, she raced over to Christ Episcopal Church on South Washington Street, right where the present-day church is located now. Dora rushed in through the back to warn her husband to stay inside. Then she returned home to guard their store. Once she saw the Confederates ride off, she returned to the church.
I thought they had all gone, and I went back to the church to tell my prisoners to wait another hour and they would be safe. When Mr. Bowie said, "Here comes a squad," there was an ominous halt outside, and the door opened. The gentleman never stirred. I never changed my position. Emma Holland gave a slight sob. There was dead silence, but in the growing dark I could see that Mr. Higgins and Mr. Bowie were deadly pale. Then, "Is Mr. Dawson here?" "Yes, sir." Rising, he walked out, Emma Holland with them. "Mr. Higgins, come out." I went up and threw my arms around Mr. Higgins. "Goodbye." "No leave-taking, if you please," said the lieutenant. In solemn procession, we moved up the street as far as the square, when the captain said, "Ladies, you can go no further."
While in Rockville, Stuart paused here at the home of Charles Prettyman, while some of his men ventured as far south as Tenleytown in the pursuit of a wagon train of Union supplies. After gathering up the town's better-known Unionists, cutting important telegraph lines, and sweeping up available horses, General Stuart moved on to Brookville. There, the prisoners were eventually released. Stuart continued on to meet General Lee at Gettysburg. Because of his stopover in Rockville, he arrived 2 days into that crucial 3-day battle. Some historians speculate that if Stuart had not lingered in Rockville, the outcome at Gettysburg might have been very different. At the same time, portions of the Union Army were moving through Montgomery County, hoping to intercept Lee. At Edwards Ferry, they pulled off an astonishing engineering feat. General Joseph Hooker and his Army of the Potomac crossed the river into Maryland right down here using 2 1,400-foot-long pontoon bridges. Just think about that for a moment. 75,000 men and who knows how many horses, along with wagons carrying their supplies and weapons, made their way across a makeshift bridge that Union engineers had constructed from pontoons. The physical impact of this crossing on the canal and the surrounding area was enormous. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought on the first 3 days of July 1863. Fierce fighting raged on the land surrounding the little Pennsylvania town. The outcome could not have been anticipated, given initial Confederate success. But finally, on the 3rd day, Meade's army held off Lee and his men, ending their invasion of the North. This 3-day battle resulted in approximately 51,000 American casualties, the most of any battle in the American Civil War. Later that year, on November 13th, Abraham Lincoln delivered his historic Gettysburg Address, honoring those who lost their lives in this battle and redefining the purpose of the war.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged.
The tide was turning, but the war wasn't finished with Montgomery County just yet.